he employed English lawyers, and then only not that long ago, a few months ago, at the end of last year, he finally, after all of these years, just came out and said it was a sort of Scooby-Doo moment where he sort of pulled off his mask and said, actually, I've been lying for the last 5 years and I really did found the Wagner Group. Yeah, so I mean, this is a particularly extreme case in a phenomenon which is getting quite a lot of attention, especially since the invasion of Ukraine, which is sort of so-called sort of strategic lawsuits which target journalists who are often investigating the activities of sort of rich and powerful people. But in this instance, it's sort of fairly unique because this man, Yevgeny Prigozhin, as you said, he is runs the Wagner mercenary group. He spent years denying any connection to mercenary activity and went to vast lengths to protect his reputation and to threaten to sue anyone who suggested that he had any connection, in spite of mounting evidence and horrific reports of human rights abuses, rapes, executions, torture, the murdering of journalists, the worst crimes imaginable. And so this case and these cases where, especially the targeting of Elliot Higgins of Bellingcat, were fairly remarkable because he employed English lawyers, and then only not that long ago, a few months ago, at the end of last year, he finally, after all of these years, just came out and said it was a sort of Scooby-Doo moment where he sort of pulled off his mask and said, actually, I've been lying for the last 5 years and I really did found the Wagner Group. So it was arguably the most abusive piece of defamation litigation in this country's history.
And what about the UK government's action in helping him to circumvent the sanctions that were in place at the time? I mean, the US government have just designated Wagner Inc. a transactional criminal organization, which meant they could impose even tougher sanctions. The UK government has significantly perhaps failed to do so, which would of course mean that we could bring in tougher sanctions. There's a lot of rhetoric about how we support Ukraine and so on, but with the Wagner Group so intrinsically involved in that action there, it does feel rather odd that the UK government seems to be taking, standing back a little bit.
So it's a complicated issue in the sense that the lawyers, who I spoke to, a lot of them, their point of view, most of them, they argue everyone in the whole world deserves the right to access legal representation. So even if you are a mass murderer, the most reprehensible person on earth, is an integral part of the rule of law that you can access representation, legal representation. And so in the case of sanctioned individuals, they have to apply to the UK Treasury to get that permission. The lawyers have to get permission to work for them. But then the counter argument to that is that in the case of Prigozhin, this was civil litigation. So these were, he wasn't being forced by a state to defend himself in court. He was choosing to take people to court. And so, the critics of these lawyers would say, they were basically being used as pawns in by a man who was running an extremely elaborate and egregious multi-year lie to sort of attack his enemies. And so it is a difficult balance, though, in terms of allowing people to have legal representation whilst also not allowing international criminals committing war crimes and atrocities to abuse the English legal system.
And it is extraordinary. He's gone from denying his role in creating Wagner to boasting about it. I mean, he seems to be a force, perhaps even to rival Putin in Russia at the moment, and particularly dangerous when you look at what the Wagner Group, the sort of havoc that they're wreaking and the crimes against humanity that they're responsible for across huge swathes of the globe.
Yes, I think the UK government, clearly it's a priority to focus on the activities of Prigozhin, and Prigozhin is someone who is arguably he's more reachable, his operations are more disruptable than other tycoons and sort of politicians close to the Kremlin, because his operations are international in scope. He runs these sort of vast sort of mercenaries for natural resources operations in countries like Sudan and Central African Republic. And so he is doing things outside of Russia, which are within the reach of they can be disrupted. These operations rely on networks of shell companies and basically surreptitious means to move money, natural resources, weapons, fighters around the world. And so I think that we're going to clearly see like a sort of renewed and continuing effort to stymie those efforts by him.
Just finally, very briefly, are we allowing a huge terrorist organization, bigger, far bigger, arguably than something like ISIS, to flourish by not designating them terrorists?
Well, I think he is sanctioned already, and I think there is an element where yes, it's important there is continued scrutiny of him, but the difference that the US designating him a transnational criminal organization, I think these are slightly technical differences. It maybe it enlarges the scope of enforcement activity potentially they can take against him. But I think I think clearly there has been a repeated and continued effort to sanction him, clamp down on him over multiple years. I don't think we can say that not enough has been done. I think it has to also be accepted that it's very, very hard to stop people like this, and that's potentially a scarier thing in the sense of it.
Indeed.
If a government could just flick a switch and stop this, that would be somewhat reassuring. But these are very crafty, very resourceful, very agile operators who have become expert in avoiding sanctions, and that is far scarier in a way.